Recent work by Professor David Barrett of the Department of Health Science at the University of York talked to constructivist grounded theory. Specifically, in an evidence-based nursing research showcase paper, Professor Barrett discusses work by Kelley, Zadvinskis, and Miller. In his paper, David provides a brief history of grounded theory. He positions constructivist grounded theory within the evolving landscape of these forms of inquiry, and he outlines some of the promise that constructivist grounded theory offers. Professor Barrett's contribution will therefore be of interest to many qualitative nurse researchers, and I'm therefore pleased to say that David has agreed to talk about constructivist grounded theory. Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and I'm joined by, to repeat, Professor David Barrett. Please, David, would you outline what is said in your paper?
Hi, Martin. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the paper. The paper itself focuses on a piece of work by Kelley and colleagues, as you've said, and their study was looking at United States nurses' experiences of working through the COVID-19 pandemic, and specifically, they generated a grounded theory from their data collection and analysis. So what I've done within my paper is almost write a bit of a commentary on that, using them to showcase some of the key elements of constructivist grounded theory. And what I wanted to try and do in the paper was three things, really. First of all, outline to readers what grounded theory is broadly as a qualitative research method. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about how grounded theory has evolved since it was first developed in the 1960s, and specifically how constructivist grounded theory was developed by Kathy Charmaz in the mid-1990s. And then within the paper also outlined some of the main component parts of a constructivist grounded theory study. So things like theoretical sampling, theoretical saturation, constant comparative analysis, and look at how Kelley and colleagues incorporated them into their study, into their reporting of the study, and use their paper as a bit of an exemplar of what a constructivist grounded theory study and paper should look like.
And it's actually a very nice paper that you've written. I have, as ever, a few questions for you. Please, can you say a little bit more about data analysis and theory generation? In your paper, you note that constructivist grounded theory differs from other forms of grounded theory in the way that researchers actively construct meaning. Now, I suspect all qualitative researchers do this. However, you are noting something overt or deliberate in this approach. Would you say a little bit more?
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. I think all qualitative researchers do, to some extent, use the data and their findings and construct some meaning around it. But the reason I mentioned it in the paper, and the reason I think it's so important when we're talking about grounded theory, is it really does differentiate between the different schools of grounded theory. So very briefly, grounded theory as an approach was developed by Glaser and Strauss in the 1960s, and has that core at its heart that the theory at the end of the study is generated from the data. The data leads the generation of the grounded theory. But the role that the researcher plays, and the role the researcher plays in being either passive or active and constructing that grounded theory, that's what differentiates the different types of grounded theory that have evolved since then. So if you like, the classic traditional grounded theory, which Glaser still held on to for many, many years, sees the researcher as being completely unbiased, completely passive almost, and just letting the data lead the way until the truth reveals itself, and that kind of feeds into some of that discussion about emergence, which we may pick up on later. Strauss, who went in a slightly different direction with other colleagues, had a slightly different view. Still provided this view that the researcher and the reality are separate, but did see the researcher as slightly more active, having a number of different analytical procedures, a number of different analytical tools that allowed them to verify and develop theory, but still seeing reality and researcher as very, very separate. Constructivist GT, which is, as I say, Kathy Charmaz developed in the 1990s, sees the role of researcher not simply to collect data, not simply to identify emerging themes and generate theory, but instead the researcher works with their data, and predominantly that will be data from participants, but might also include data from other literature, data from writing memos and such like, but using that data to construct a reality that's shaped by the data that it includes. And in fact, in constructivist grounded theory, the theory itself is dependent on the input of the researcher. It's dependent on that researcher interacting with participants and identifying that contextually valid reality, really. So as you look at the different schools of grounded theory, and in reality, they probably exist on a bit of a spectrum, on a bit of a sort of methodological spiral, I think it's sometimes referred to. But when you look at traditional Glazerian grounded theory and then constructivist grounded theory, it's that role of the researcher as an active participant themselves in constructing the reality that makes it so different.
Mm. I've always thought that there's something strange about the idea that of it's almost like in the early iterations of this thing, the idea that the researcher was almost stepping back in
Yeah.
an objective way. But let me talk about emergence. In the same passage, you talk about emergence. However, emergence is a very contested term. It can mean or suggest different things to different people. What for you does it mean to say that themes emerge? Does this not occasionally, at least, suggest that meaning exists independently within a transcript and emerges when brought to the surface as if it was being mined? I don't doubt this isn't what you think. Constructivism and constructivists presumably don't think about or use emergence in this way. However, what then is meant by emergence?
A really interesting question. You're right. It is a contested term, and you will see some academic literature where people talk in very strong terms about the fact that we shouldn't be using the word emergence in qualitative research. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that, I suppose, and one which I understand and one which is perhaps less troubling. The one which I think is probably less troubling from my perspective is I think people are concerned sometimes by the passiveness that suggests on the part of the researcher. This idea, as you say, that things just appear, they just come into view every now and again, almost if you're driving along and you turn down a road and suddenly you see a mountain emerge on the horizon, that you've done nothing really active. It's just there. I suppose I like to think of it slightly differently, and I'm trying to think of an analogy. If you've got somebody who's restoring a painting, then it takes an awful lot of skill on the part of the restorer. But as they do their work, they will new details and new elements of that painting will emerge. So I don't necessarily think that emergence means passivity or a lack of skill on the part of the researcher. It does sometimes take a lot of skill and work to almost facilitate emergence of something. So the passivity element of it, I don't worry so much about. I think the bit which you've highlighted, which is really important, and I think is more challenging, is that for something to emerge, it does suggest that there is there is an empirical truth somewhere in those interviews you've had with people, or the literature you've read, or the memos you've taken. And if you just look hard enough and you're skilled as a researcher, that truth will, as you say, emerge. It will pop out. And of course, in most qualitative research, and certainly in constructivist grounded theory, it is much more complicated than that. It is not a simple truth that exists and it's there for everybody. Every reality is different. It has to be constructed collaboratively between the researcher and the participant. So in that sense, I can absolutely see why sometimes emergence is not a true reflection of what really happens and is an oversimplification. I do think that it's still a useful word on occasions. I do think that all of us as qualitative researchers will suddenly read something or hear something, and there will be something so obvious that comes out that you could say, actually, that has emerged in the data. That is something which has appeared very, very clearly from one or more participants. But at the same time, I think it needs to be more nuanced than that. And that's why you see terms in a lot of qualitative research generally, constructivist grounded theory more broadly, or more specifically, sorry, where you talk about findings, themes, categories being generated, being identified, most importantly, though, being constructed. And I think that's the key word when we're talking about constructivist GT, like my paper and the paper by Kelley and colleagues.
Because from my perspective, I always think of sometimes when we talk about these things, it's as if data exists for me independently of analysis, where I would want to argue that data becomes data when it's incorporated into analysis, and it's very difficult to pull those things always apart. Anyway, another of the terms that you use is saturation, and I think you've mentioned that already. So you recognize that saturation is another of these difficult concepts, and indeed a small but feisty literature hostile to data saturation and all that phrase implies exists. Would you say a little bit more about saturation? Does the term make sense? Should it be retired?
I think that, yeah, I like the term feisty literature, and you're absolutely right. You know, there is that small body of literature where people talk about saturation and say it's not a term we should be using anymore. So broadly speaking, where it is used, and it is used still in an awful lot of qualitative work, is it's used to demonstrate that point at which data collection can cease. And it can cease because, as a researcher, you're no longer finding fresh data from your interviews, for example, in which, and I think this is the way Kathy Sharmad's described it, was no longer sparking new theoretical insights. So you're talking to people, you're doing more focus groups, you're reading more, but you're not finding anything new. And that's the point. The researcher might say, right, I don't need to do any more interviews, for example. But it is a contested term, and the reason it's contested is because it certainly implies that there is nothing new to find out there. And we know that's never really the case, particularly in qualitative research and particularly in constructivist grounded theory, where it's founded on the fact that everybody's reality is different. And if everybody's reality is different, then I may find 99 things by talking to 99 people, but I will always find something new by talking to the 100th person, because that will be their own individual reality. So it may be that I'm not getting as many theoretical insights. It may be that I'm hearing things I've heard before, but I don't think we can say that we will never find anything new if we don't continue to do more and more and more interviews. And I think that's why people have concerns about the term saturation. One of the things that grounded theory does that helps with that a little bit is it doesn't really always necessarily need to be looked at in terms of there's nothing new available, but instead that we've got enough data available to analyze and allow for the theory to be generated, for the theory to be verified to an extent, for the different elements of the theory, the relationships between different elements to be fully explained. So it more means, from a grounded theory sense, that we've got enough rather than we've got everything there is to know. And maybe from that point of view, the word saturation is not the best one, because I think we think of it as meaning we've got everything. And one of the terms that's been used before is theoretical sufficiency, which probably is a more accurate term, but it's just not quite as nice a term. And I think as long as when we're talking about saturation, we explain what we mean, we recognise the limitations of that term, we identify what it is that it means in the grounded theory context. I'm not troubled by it, but I can understand why some people may think it's an oversimplification of where we are. What I would say, and what I think is really important, is whatever we call it, whether we call it theoretical saturation or theoretical sufficiency, or we find something else that people are more comfortable with, that with anybody writing up any kind of qualitative study, that there's a clear justification for how and why the decision to stop data collection was made. And I think when there is the most concern about theoretical saturation as a term, it's when it's just dropped in, at the end of a method section, saying data collection stopped when theoretical saturation was reached, without any kind of justification or analysis or critique of what that could mean.
I think I react against it because of what I see as the implicit distinction between data and analysis and theory generation that's rolled up into the term, and also the peculiarity that so few or no qualitative researchers, they've chosen to interview a dozen people, and data saturation always seems to happen on the last interview. I can't remember many studies where people have gone off and said data saturation has not yet occurred, I now need to find another couple of people. So I do find the term peculiar in many respects.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think what's really important is that people avoid doing exactly what you described there, which is use it as a convenient stopping off point, which happens to align with when they've run out of participants or their time has got to a point where they can't do anymore. If those are the reasons we've had to stop, for pragmatic reasons, we need to say those are the reasons we've had to stop. If we as researchers are truly at a point where we don't think we're getting anything. Again, anything new is a difficult way of describing it, but where we're not finding that the data is adding more the more and more we collect, then we can make an argument that we've got sufficient data or we've saturated. But it shouldn't be a catch-all term for I stopped because I had no participants left.
Yeah, I agree. You also note that constructivist grounded theory interviews should be flexible and responsive. Can you say a little bit more about this? Flexibility and responsiveness are very positive concepts. Who wouldn't want to be these things or react in these ways? However, are there potential downsides to unlimited plasticity, is there a point at which interviews and what's discussed in interviews diverge so much from each other that comparison becomes strained or unfeasible? Constructivist grounded theory relies on constant comparison. Does this not demand a modicum or a semblance of uniformity, a limit to flexibility?
Yeah, and it is that real tension, as you say, because you need the fact that your realities within a grounded theory study or constructivist grounded theory study specifically are being constructed by the researcher and with the participants. It does mean you do need that flexibility, you do need that reflexiveness, you do need your interview schedule, your areas of focus to evolve as you go through, as you move through the development of grounded theory. But you're absolutely right. At the same point, you can't have sort of methodological anarchy where the researcher suddenly changes the goalposts at a whim, depending on which direction they think they want to go. I think there's a couple of things that can protect against that. So though the interviews may evolve and will evolve over time, their core purpose, the aims of the study, the coherence of the grounded theory that's being constructed, I think they should and they will act as a kind of methodological anchor. So there's always something where you can say, okay, things have developed, things have evolved, but it always harks back to this is what is at the core of the study. And the second is that when the approach does evolve, when it does change over time, whether that's in terms of sampling or interview or analysis, there needs to be that transparency when the study is reported. So I'll give you a very quick example if that's okay, and it's actually related more to sampling, but it just sort of demonstrates the flexibility of constructivist grounded theory, but also how you need to make sure it's clear and reported and transparent. So I've got a PhD student doing a really interesting study on why people with end-stage renal failure refuse dialysis. So her group of participants to start with, the people she started sampling were those people who had end-stage renal failure and had refused dialysis, obviously. But what she found as she was moving through that data collection and analysis was that this was all part of a decision-making journey. And the people she was talking to initially were people who'd got to the point of decision-making journey where they were still refusing. But she recognized that to fully understand that decision-making journey, she also had to start talking to people who had refused initially, but then had, for some reason, then decided they would have dialysis. So her sampling changed, her theoretical sampling altered in such a way that she moved to a different group of participants to enable her to develop a fuller grounded theory. So that was quite a big evolution, but it's still linked to the core aims of the study. It's still linked to the core purpose. It was all coherent with how a grounded theory was developing, and critically, it's all reported very, very clearly. This is why she did it and how she did it. So as a supervisor, I felt really comfortable that even though she was developing and evolving her study, she was doing it in a way that wasn't just on a whim, and there was structure and purpose to it.
I mean, that does make sense. That's a good answer, I think, to that question. One more question. Journal reviewers famously always demand that the detail of coding be identified in research reports, and that's probably sensible. However, critics have suggested that the reporting of qualitative coding can triumph or take precedence over analysis. That is, qualitative research reports give more attention to describing coding processes sometimes than they do analysis and a defense of analysis. Do you have any thoughts on that particular debate?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about that description of processes versus the outline of analysis. And I think, I mean, one of the joys of grounded theory, I would argue anyway, is that the process and the analysis are so closely linked that you have to cover both of them really, because the process of becoming more and more embedded in the data through the different stages of coding within grounded theory is such a critical element of analysis. So that's, I think, one of the joys of grounded theory for me is the fact that the analytical process or the coding process, the analytical process are so closely interlinked. The tools that you're provided within grounded theory mean that if you are going through that process, if you are using those analytical tools, if you're using and with most grounded theory, it's a kind of 3-stage coding process that you go through, that by doing that, you will be enhancing your analysis. You'll be able to demonstrate to the reader the journey of analysis that you go through. And it doesn't just become a checklist of, I did coding like this, and I did coding like that, and here are some codes I produced. The whole thing is very holistic in terms of the way that coding, analytical tools, and generation of theory are all merged together and become quite blurred. So from a GT perspective, I worry less about that because of the way that the process and the analysis are so closely interlinked. And there's a lovely term, and it's actually from Strauss, in terms of grounded theory and the analysis of grounded theory, talking about the fact that he offers, or him and Juliet Corbin offer, this smorgasbord of analytical techniques within which researchers can choose from. So by using those different tools and those different stages, which include coding, and like I say, including in grounded theory 3 stages of coding, I think that provides enough reassurance that the analysis is being discussed as well as the process. I hope that answers that question, because it's a really interesting question.
It does. David, thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you for talking to me. Links to Professor Barrett's work and the document discussed are provided in the notes. And so once more, David, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Martin.